basically have to just model it out for people in our behavior. So for example, when the New York Times piece came out on you about 3 weeks ago, the enforced monogamy piece. Now the author of it, I'm not even going to mention her name, but if you want to, you can go ahead. She sat in the green room with us, I think on the first night in Toronto. She was all smiles, friendly. Yeah. You even said to me how much you like her, and you introduced me to her, and we were chatting. She seemed perfectly pleasant and lovely. And then, of course, this piece comes out. It implies that you're for forced monogamy, why don't you just explain that real quick? Just do a 1 minute recap on what you were talking about.
The implication was, and to the degree that this has been, let's say, exaggerated in the aftermath of the piece, the implication was that I was promoting the idea that perfectly innocent women would be lined up by the state and distributed en masse to undeserving males so that they wouldn't be violent.
We've only done that at one show, right?
Yeah, well, exactly. And it didn't go that well.
It did not go well.
That was quite curious, because that part of the conversation I had with the journalist lasted probably 2 minutes out of what was essentially a 2-day interview. And it was obviously something that triggered her imagination in the sense that she saw that she could use it for I don't know, for political purposes or something like that in the piece. But it was so palpably absurd because and I would say amateurish in some sense as well, because the position that she accused me of holding, I didn't hold, so that's the first problem. B, no one holds. Like, if you're going to try to pillory someone in a manner that's at least vaguely believable, you should accuse them of holding a view that at least some person has held at some point.
Right.
And no one has ever held that view. And then the other thing that was quite off-putting, let's say, is that she's not stupid. She knew perfectly well what I meant by enforced monogamy, by the term. It's an anthropological term. It's been used for 100 years. And the idea that polygamous societies, which would be the contrast, say, to monogamous societies, the idea that they're more violent is, no one disputes that.
Yeah.
It's like it's an anthropological, sociological, and psychological truism. And it's also one that's been, it's not like the left has been promoting polygamy. So it was well, the article surprised me, to say the least.
Well, yeah, but you made an interesting move after that, which ties this all together, because you did a little checking on the phrase in the archives of the New York Times.
Well, the whole point to me was, if I could take Jordan out of the equation and I could make it into the New York Times wrestling with itself, I was pretty sure that the New York Times would have some record of having used the phrase enforced monogamy at some point. And so I went to the search engine and I put in, quote, enforced monogamy, close quote. And sure enough, there were 2 relatively recent references within the last 20, 25 years, both of them positive. One, I believe, coming out of evolutionary theory in Drosophila, where it's a less common term in evolutionary theory, but it has leaked into the evolutionary literature. And the other one coming from Afghanistan, where you have polygamous marriage, and that leaves too many violent young men with nothing to do, and that can be useful if you're conquesting other lands, saying, well, you have no wife here, but there's territory over there. And this is exactly, the New York Times was celebrating the idea that in a culture that was at that stage in its evolution, enforced monogamy was something that went hand in hand with women's rights, because of course having
which is the classic argument,
having fewer violent men with no romantic prospects is in general good for the safety of women. And so the whole thing
is actually my point.
Well, I know, I know. But the point was, can I take Jordan out of it and say the New York Times is wrestling with itself and not fairly? And this is the great danger, is that finger is on the scale. Now the other thing is that particular journalist first was talking with Brett well before talking with you, and then Brett sent this journalist to me. And by the way, I don't think that we should not talk about the name of the journalist, since the journalist is certainly using your name, and the idea, so it's Nellie Bowles, and I found her engaging, charming, very quick, intelligent. The thing that I didn't appreciate, and I got fairly far into my discussion with her, and I was off the record, is, she began with the gambit, well, of course I'm going to be running your tweet on James Damore, which, went viral and was widely misinterpreted, and again in a deliberate fashion, which my tweet was responding to somebody saying, if human resources, somebody else from Google tweeted, if human resources won't do something about this, then they're going to have trouble on their hands. And I was like, okay, you're telling people to run to human resources because James Damore is looking at big 5 psychometrics for personality and asking the question, how do we increase the accessibility of Google to female coders? And whether you agree with his technique or not, I think that was clearly his point. So the idea is I'm going to bring up this tweet that has been widely mischaracterized of yours, Eric. And what became clear was she had the idea that she wanted to find the men's rights activist community.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And she said something about, well, you're MRA. Mm-hmm. And I didn't even know what that meant. So I said, NRA? I thought it was National Rifle Association.
Right.
And she's like, men's rights activists. I said, what? And so we had this.
Well, that was just you being disingenuous, because of course you know what men's rights activists are.
Right. Well,
secretly, you are one.
Okay. Yeah. But the point would be, it's like, you believe in human rights, yes. Well, men are human, so you believe in men's rights. And you believe that one should be active, so, at some level, it's a reserved term for people who are very often kind of veering a spectrum of people who are talking about bad aspects of family, law versus people who are downright misogynists.
Right.
And I was just aghast, which is like, why are you trying to shoehorn me into this pre-existing thing?
Well, that's the question. It's the motivation for the shoehorning. And
this is the big issue coming. It's hard to track all the threads. Let me just get back to it. What we don't understand is that they've invested in all of this cognitive Lego, right? So they've the equity or toxic masculinity or
white privilege,
whatever these things are, and so everything in high dimensional space gets shoved into this completely inappropriate kind of cognitive Lego.
Yes, absolutely.
Furthermore, the format of these things, like I recently got asked to do a bit on a show on television on an established network, and they said, we're really blowing it out. We've got the message that this new form of long form interview is the wave of the future. It's like, well, how much am I going to get?
Oh.
We might go from 5 to 8 minutes.
Right.
And so the idea is like,
you can't say hello in 5 minutes.
But this is the point, right? It's like, I have access to 3 hours when I want it.
Right.
You're like, well, that's insane.
Right.
It's like, they can't move that much.
No.
And so
that's partly why the format's dying. Because, and it's also, I think, one of the reasons that we think we're stupider than we are.
I like this point a lot.
Including our audience, is that, because TV, one of the things I have noticed about television in general is that it's predicated on the presumption that the audience is stupid. But if you have to force everything through a channel whose maximum dimension is 6 minutes, then everyone's going to look stupid.
This is the thing. If you think about what happened, where television went from being the dumb medium to the incredibly smart medium, when you went from TV dramas of a half an hour or maybe an hour in length to many, many shows over a season, developing characters at a level that a film can't touch.
Right? Yeah, and that literature approaches.
Right. So the idea is that in The Sopranos or Mad Men or Game of Thrones, people are following incredibly difficult and rich plots. And you have to go back to this old adage, which nobody ever lost a dime underestimating the intelligence of the American people. Well, that's only true if you don't understand opportunity cost, because people have been not losing dimes but millions by not understanding that anyone who can follow Game of Thrones, right? How is it that this thing that we're about to do, I have no idea why, we're just having a conversation. There's going to be over 100,000 views of this thing, I think, very quickly.
Yeah.
I got one video on my channel of any substance. One video, it's got nearly 60,000 views. People are hungry for this thing that they're being starved for.
Yes,
and what they don't understand in the regular media is that their format is killing them. And
and this is something we really have to pay attention to, because a tremendous amount of what's going on is the consequence. You said that a complex reality is being shoveled into a tiny dimensional space, and so there's some ideological reasons for that. But I think some of that is being fed by the channels of the media, because it's a lot easier to take a complex situation like that and shovel it into a pre-existing a priori interpretive space, because everyone already understands it. So if you've only got a few minutes, then there's a bunch of things that you don't have to explain because you're just telling the same old
It's worse
story.
than that, because what we also don't grasp is that we don't file flight plans. Like, you're having me on the show, you don't know what I'm going to say. You don't know what my positions are on immigration. You don't know what my positions are on abortion. We've never gotten to that, I don't think. And
I was actually thinking that about both of you. I don't think we've ever discussed it. We can get into it.
we
but
can.
yeah.
But what the way this commentariat works, and I've been waking up to the idea that this layer even exists because I didn't think about it too much, is that mostly these people have consistent takes. That is, they are counted upon to take complicated reality and, give us the Tom Friedman point. Give us the Paul Krugman point. Give us the Ezra Klein view. And you're thinking, well, why is there a sort of regular, consistent view on these things? Like, I've watched Jordan, I've watched you change your mind in real time as somebody makes a good argument. And it's a little bit painful because somebody was listening to you and then they say, well, how do I have faith in your argument? And then my answer is, how do you have faith in any of this stuff? All of this stuff can reverse it. Won't you have more faith if somebody can reverse themselves? I'm thinking about this thing about the baking a cake for a gay couple.
Yes. Well, look what happened. Good, when we'll get back to Nellie Bowles, because I want to return to that. But one of the things that was really interesting to watch in Vancouver, I just had 2 discussions with Sam Harris, and the discussion was set up from a promotional perspective by a promoter who was doing his job as a kind of a combat situation, right? There was going to be a victory. It would be Sam or me in the final analysis. But
versus, it actually.
Versus, right.
Yeah.
And so, but what happened was that Sam and I actually had a discussion where we were trying to lay out our points, to understand each other's points, and we set this up. It was one of Brett's ideas, actually, because Brett, your brother, moderated. When the second discussion opened, what he had us do was summarize each other's arguments. So I put forth Sam's arguments in the strongest possible terms, and he did the same. And that worked just fine, by the way. But what was so interesting was the audience would have settled for a debate that culminated in the victory of one of us over the other. But instead, what happened was they got engaged in a discussion that we had both designed to push both of our capabilities of thinking farther along. And so, and we weren't sure if that would work because we weren't sure if we could talk, but it turned out that we could, and partly thanks to Brett's help. And then the original format was we were going to talk for an hour for the first one, and then we were going to open it up to Q&A. But the discussion got very intense, and I likened it to an approximate level of a pretty good PhD defense. If you have a good student who's defending, and they know the literature, you can really go after them because it gives them a chance to show their mastery, right? So it can be a real positive thing for them. And so it was like a dual PhD defense, D-U-A-L and D-U-E-L at the same time. But the audience was right there with us.
Right.
And then at the end of the hour, Brett asked them, should we switch to the Q&A or should we continue the discussion? Because we're in the middle of something. And overwhelmingly, the sentiment was, continue the discussion. And so we did model the process of, I wouldn't say respectful dialogue, because first of all, that's a cliche, and second of all, that wasn't what this was. What we were doing was actually engaging in the process of trying to make both of us smarter than we were. And people are in for that. They're on board for that. And they would prefer that to the cheap victory, by all appearances.
So what do you think that